Hey, it's Drybear. The Monster Hunter Wilds open beta is starting today for PlayStation Early Access and in a couple days on Thursday for PC, Xbox, and PlayStation. And the first thing you want to do in this demo/open beta is figure out what weapon you're going to want to be playing with when the game comes out. Now, the reason I say this is that because of the demo, you're going to be giving a full set of gear and an equal level of every single weapon in the game, which is something that you're not going to have in the normal playthrough of Monster Hunter Wilds. Anytime you want to switch weapons, you'll have to craft a new one, and it's going to take some time before you can actually get a full set of gear to test out the weapon you want. Of the 14 weapons in the mainline series, as well as the new mechanics going on, you're going to want to be informed on what's going on, what weapons are out there, and figure out which one you're going to enjoy playing the most, and the demo is the best place to do that. Well, let's start with an overview of what's changing in Wilds so you can understand where the weapons came from in previous series and what's changing about them going into Wilds. The first thing is going to be the new mechanic, the focus mode. This is when you see those three indicators on your reticle on screen. All the weapons will have a focus mode that they can enter, which unlocks new abilities, new functionality for every single one of them. On top of that, there is a wound mechanic, which you'll be able to wound the target in specific spots. You will see a visible wound appear, it'll start glowing, and some weapons will have interactions with these wounds as well, and you want to know what those are per weapon. It's also worth mentioning that there is a mechanic that they haven't shown too much of, which is a clash mechanic, which some weapons, specifically the guard weapons, if they time a block properly, will be able to go into a special clash animation with the monster, which means that you can lock the monster down into a 1v1 power struggle and hold them there, which is great for parties, but also just very cinematic. And as a brief review from what worked in Monster Hunter World and all the things that they experimented with in Monster Hunter Rise that they're bringing into Monster Hunter Wilds, it's important to note what they learned from all of those experiments. The first one is, in Rise, they ended up giving a lot of weapons a counter mechanic. Weapons that didn't previously have a way to parry or counter the monster got one, and in fact, most of the best weapons in Rise had a parry or counter that they could use. Now, the weapons that were overall benefiting from that aspect kept it, like the switch axe, and ended up keeping their parry, and there's also some nice parries now with the bow, as well as the light Bowgun that can play off of that as well. And you'll notice that a lot of the monster encounters in Wilds, although they're not as arcadey and like brutish as they are in Rise, they ended up keeping a lot of that kind of quick time parry, well-timed attack interaction that you'll be able to have in this. So you'll find that a lot of weapons have new mini staggers or offsets, which means if you hit the monster right as they're hitting you on the right frame, you'll end up giving them a mini stagger and knocking them off balance. There's also some weapons that can do the clash animation with the right guard, and some weapons that can dodge at the right moment to trigger a special animation or a special attack. So while it's not going to be as intense as Rise with all the parries and counters, a lot of the weapons do have some nice interactable skill-based element abilities that they can use in combat with really good timing aspects. And I think the new wound mechanic plays off a lot of what people liked about the Clutch Claw from Iceborne and World, that ended up creating a lot of opportunities to soften certain spots on the monster, although there's a lot of criticism around what the Clutch Claw did for Iceborne, and some people just flat out didn't like it. But I think this new wound system, where you can hit a specific target of the monster, like an area, create a wound, and then weapons can interact with that wound in special ways, creates a lot of new interesting gameplay that can be very targeted based on positioning and adjustment, and also makes some of the weapons that are very straightforward have some nice finesse elements and some higher skill ceiling elements to them as well. Without further ado, let's start with one is probably my main weapon, the weapon that I've had the most amount of hours in across all Monster Hunter games, the insect glaive. And this is probably the most changed weapon of all of Monster Hunter Wilds as well, and some things that we're going to have to talk about. The first thing is the most controversial is that they are trying to move the weapon to be more of a ground weapon in Wilds. And this is something that I think they're solving some of the core issues that insect glaive had, but they're also taking away a lot of the flair and the iconic aspect of the insect glaive, in which you were spending most of the time in the air, dashing back and forth. If you jump into the air like this and dash forward, if you land a hit in other Monster Hunter games, you would propel yourself back up into the air, and you can do that infinitely and just keep doing aerial attacks over and over. But realistically, when we look at the core gameplay for people that played a lot of insect glaive in past Monster Hunters, the problem was that the iconic aerial playstyle for the insect glaive was never really the optimal damage output. In fact, most of the time time, if you're trying to get optimal damage out of Insect Glaive, especially in World, you would spend a lot of your time on the ground doing melee combos with full Kinsect bonus. Now, there were some situations in Rise where you could actually just go up and do the downward thrust, where you fly up into the air and you pulse down with a downward thrust, though usually this came at the end of a combo as you were losing the last little bit of your stamina. But what they're trying to do with this update in Wilds for Insect Glaive is they're trying to make it a little bit more like lined up in the optimal output for damage as well as the optimal playstyle fitting in together. So the changes they're doing for Insect Glaive, which I will need to do a couple dozen hunts with this before I decide whether I like it or not, they are not going to be popping you back up in the air when you do an aerial dash from the Insect Glaive. Instead, you will follow up into older combos. There's a new move where you can actually lock onto the monster and spin around and drill into them like you're just some annoying little bug that's spinning on top of them. But what's going to happen now is a lot of your combos are going to be ground-based instead of being aerial-based now. To compensate for that, what they've done is they've combined together some of the animations that allow you to work with your Kinsect in tandem. Typically with Insect Glaive, you have these 3 buffs that you have to maintain to stack up. They're going to allow you to be able to get those buffs while attacking for most combos now. So in the middle of a swing, the Kinsect will go up and attack, and then in the middle of the next swing, you'll bring the Kinsect back, which means that you can be able to constantly be attacking on the ground while gathering buffs at the same time to maintain your buff uptime. There's also a bunch of quality of life aspects for the Insect Glaive, things like being able to preview which buff you'll get from the monster when you hit it with your Kinsect shot, which will let you know based on what the monster is. Typically, you have to learn that for yourself, but there's going to be a nice preview for it on screen. They're also doing a nice quality of life change in that the base Kinsect, basically every Kinsect in the game, can hold up to 2 buffs. Previously, you've had to have a higher level Kinsect, or only specific Kinsects can have multiple buffs at once. Now you'll be able to hold 2 for a single Kinsect, which is great by default. And now you'll still have to send out the Kinsect twice to gather both buffs. And when it returns, if it hasn't returned yet, it'll give you both those buffs right away, which means that in combination with the hybrid attacks that allow you to gather buffs while attacking, and the fact that you can have multiple buffs on one Kinsect by default, means that it's going to be way easier to maintain buff uptime for the Insect Glaive. I'm a little sad that we're not keeping the flinging dust clouds from Rise, which was a super cool new mechanic that we got in Rise, but we are keeping a little bit of the mobility aspect. They're keeping the downward thrust, which is cool. They're getting a new attack where you can drill into the target, which should be pretty fun, and a new way to mount the monster, which is also awesome. And we'll see just how the lack of overall mobility in the air plays for the Insect Glaive and how it works overall. It might end up being a little bit easier for people to pick up because then the optimal combo is a little bit more obvious rather than trying to be in the air for most of the time. And it also means that just like everybody else, you'll have to rely on flash pods and the environment to deal with flying wyverns and the like. Next is another one of my favorites, the Sword and Shield. This is your beginner. It has probably the widest range between the skill floor and the skill ceiling. It is a very low floor, very easy to pick up. It's got a lot of really nice flowing combos between attacks. It is the only weapon in the game where you're able to use items without having to sheath your weapon, and it's got a lot of combos between slashing damage, piercing damage. You can even do KO damage with the shield. It's basically an all-rounder that is good at basically everything with a lot of really cool options. Now, there's not a crazy amount that's changing for the Sword and Shield going into Wilds, but there's some minor things that you'll want to know about. So if you played Sword and Shield in World or in Rise, not a lot is changing. It's going to be the perfect rush combo that we had in Rise, so a little bit more flexible than the option we had in World, but a little bit less damage as well. Overall, the combos are basically the same, and again, if you like getting into a very straightforward weapon, Sword and Shield is there, but don't worry, that the Sword and Shield definitely has a lot of mastery because of their back hop and the perfect rush combo. The back hop is an ability that you can use from a couple different states, either with a guard position or after a roll or after a certain attacks. You can hop backwards, which means you can avoid getting hit. We're not going to keep the oils from Rise, unfortunately, so you won't be able to have those applied to the weapon, but I think what's cool about the Sword and Shield is they now have a brand new option with the focus mode Charged Chop, which is this attack where you just charge up and jump forward and slam the weapon down. But as you're going down, it's kind of like the falling slash from the Sword and Shield from before that actually has multiple hits to this attack. So not only can you clash with monsters, which is pretty cool, but you can also do your normal round slash mix-ups, your rising slash mix-ups as well, well as your shield bash combos and perfect rush and hop, but now you can also mix in the charged chop, which will give you a bunch of extra damage with multiple hits, which makes it all even more solidified as a strong elemental weapon since you have so many fast hits going out overall. Next, let's talk about the hammer, the Bonk King, the highest KO damage in the game. This is another weapon like Sword and Shield that isn't changing too much in Wilds, but there's going to be some new mix-ups and new options as well as the focus mode that you'll be able to play around with. This weapon is super fun because you get a lot of really nice combos when coming off of ledges and errors, because you can do a lot of bonk damage with that. You have some really big windups, and it's also super satisfying when you actually counter hit an enemy, which means as they're about to hit you, you hit them instead. Plus, you just go into these crazy smashes. The Big Bang combo is still there. The golf swing is still there. You'll still be charging up the weapon, and I think in Wilds they had made a lot of changes to level 1 and level 2 charges so that they can be a little bit more useful, so it's not just going to level 3 every single time. Spinning Bludgeon is going to be the same. Most of your movement abilities are going to be the same. Your aerial attacks are going to be the same, and the overall Big Bang combo is going to be the same. However, there's some nice focus attack mix-ups that you can do as well, and again, like I said, they also added in new options for you to be able to use your level 1 and level 2 charge. If you've never played the hammer before, most of the gameplay is winding up. You can lean down and hold your weapon, which starts building up charge, and you can move while doing this, and depending on the level of the charge, increases the damage and KO amount of the attack that follows up as well. They added a follow-up from the golf swing into Big Bang, which is really cool, and they also added a nice little side hop to it as well, which gives you a little bit more mobility. They also added this ridiculous like hair flip ability where you're just going full metalhead, spinning the hammer around and around, but generally if you've played hammer before, it's going to play basically the same that it has in other Monster Hunters. Next, let's talk about the Hunting Horn, a weapon that changes quite significantly with most main installments, and I think a lot of people would agree that the Monster Hunter World version of Hunting Horn was a better iteration than Rise, and luckily the version we're getting in Wilds is much closer to World, though with a lot of significant improvements on the gameplay and the feel of the weapon. You will be able to do some good KO damage, some overall strong damage, and they're putting a bunch of quality of life changes that make the buffs and the deployables for this weapon a lot more usable for yourself and against the enemy, and also for your teammates when you're in a group hunt. So one of the cool new mechanics that we're getting for Wild's Hunting Horn is the ability to deploy out your songs in an area. So the buff will linger there for a while. People that cross over the threshold can grant the buffs themselves. Any offensive abilities you can leave in the area as well and cause some really cool planning, kind of like a light bowgun, putting stakes in the ground or setting up in the area. Hunting Horn will be able to do that now by planting deployables in an area, which is really, really cool. They're also doing some UI and overall quality of life changes to make the Hunting Horn a lot more useful. One is when a buff is about to end, like I think it's under 20 seconds, the buff will start flashing, letting you know it's about to end. So if you're trying to keep high buff uptime for yourself or for your teammates, you can easily keep track of that by using the UI, which was always more of like an internal thing for you before. Additionally, they're adding in a lot more combo options for the Hunting Horn. You have the echoes that you can store in as well, and I believe in the focus mode, the focus strike mode, you can actually store up to 5 notes instead of 3, which gives you a lot of really easy options, and you can also switch between movements a lot easier without losing your current note, which means that you can build those up as well. It is going to be the world version where you have to combo the right notes together, use the right buffs, and then use those for attacks. You do have some nice offensive options, and of course with the deployables and the refreshing buffs, it's going to make it a lot easier to get those buffs going. So whether using Hunting Horn by yourself or in a party, you can get a lot of value out of it. And also remember, in Wilds, you can carry 2 weapons with you anywhere you go, which means that you can carry 2 different of the same weapons. Some people will do that. Depending on what you're facing, you might have a different weapon that you want to use. Or some people might actually bring a Hunting Horn and their main weapon, buff themselves up, switch to their main weapon, and start fighting, because all you have to do is go to your mount, pull out your other weapon, and get back in the action, which means that it is a nice option for an offhand if people want to use it that way. Next up is one of my all-time favorite weapons. I don't get to use it all that much because in some games it can be a little one-dimensional, but it is the lance. This is your heavy armor weapon. It has a big shield and a big lance, does tons of damage, usually if you can use it properly, but it usually boils down to a very simple playstyle, which they are changing in Wilds. It also is a guard weapon, so you can do clashes with this weapon as well, and it does give you a lot of options for defense, and the way I like to describe the lance is that it feels like a boxing match. It's one of the few weapons in the game where you can stand toe-to-toe with the monster monster face to face and trade blows back and forth as if you were a monster yourself without having to run away constantly, dodge, or reset. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm going to miss the yo-yo attacks from Rise. And what you were able to do in Rise, which was super fun, is you could use your wire bugs to slide across the screen with the lance out, just piercing and sliding and dashing all around, which made the lance super fun and super awesome. So in this version of the game, we're back to like the world playstyle. We're using your small side steps, your round slashes, or your wide sweeps into your 3-hit combo. Generally with the lance, you hit 3 times, then you reset, then you hit 3 times, then you reset. However, in Wilds, we're getting a new expansion of this, which you'll see in the gameplay already, is that not only are we keeping the kind of very guarded, heavy back and forth boxing match that we have with Lance, but we're now also getting options for using the shield offensively. So you have your normal 3-hit combos, your wide slash, your perfect counters. You go down and you can do your return stab as well, where you can do like your vengeance strikes, do that kind of thing, deal damage if you block properly. But now we're also going to be able to bash, swing our shield, do shield damage for more KO, and also mix up our attacks using the shield as well. So if you like the traditional Lance gameplay, being able to dash around from like far away, use elevation for big hits, but also just to stand your ground, it's one of the few weapons that can do this properly, where you're never really afraid of what's in front of you. As long as you're playing properly and you know what you're doing, you can actually stand face to face with a monster, and now you'll be able to mix up your 3-hit combos with more shield attacks and combos as well to give lots of really new interesting mix-ups that we didn't have before. Moving on to Gunlance, the other variant of the lance. And I think one of the best ways to describe what Gunlance is that it's just an arsenal of abilities. It probably has the most variety of different playstyles based on the shelling type, range type, and how you use the weapon. You can go for long shelling, short shelling, you can go for worm stake combos, you can go for full burst combos, and unfortunately we are going to be losing the blast dump, the blast jump, the dash, the Gundam launch that we got from Rise, which is going to be sad to see it go, but I think it probably is for the best. Now, kind of like the sword and shield or the hammer, not too much is changing with the Gunlance functionality, but there's going to be a lot of quality of life that goes into it. One of these, which is really huge, is the ability to hold on to your shells longer and also reduce the amount of durability or sharpness that you're losing with each shell, which means if you go for a heavy shelling build, you're not going to be punished as heavily on the sharpening front, which was a big part of Gunlance gameplay in the past. And one of my favorite changes is the ability to sweep side to side while shelling at the same time. I think one of the downsides, especially if you're going long shelling on the Gunlance, is positioning can get kind of rough with some of the monsters that have high mobility or have the ability to dash around the arena. So now you're going to be able to do a wide sweep or a sidestep while shelling simultaneously, which means if you're doing a full shell build without doing long shelling, you can actually just dump shells as you go side to side, giving you that ability to reposition. There's also this brand new ability, which is pretty goofy but super fun. You'll be able to turn your Gunlance into a drill and shove it into the monster as it's drilling and penetrating, which gives you a new option there. We are losing the blast dash. You're not gonna be able to gun them around anymore, but now you can have some nice options here where you could just turn it into a drill and just shove it into the monster as it pierces and follow up with different options. And I believe you can even hold up to 2 wyvern fires now as well. So the side shelling with other combos, lower sharpness loss on top of that with the new move, I think is going to make Gunlance a lot more interesting to play. Next, let's talk about the ranged weapons, because not everyone is going to enjoy having melee weapons as their primary. And again, keep in mind in Wilds, you can have a backup weapon on your mount, like stored with you as you go around, which means you can get to your mount, go on your Sekrat, mount up and change weapons when you want to, which does create a lot more options for utility. But let's talk about the light bowgun and what makes it unique and interesting. One of my favorite parts about the light bowgun versus all the other ranged weapons is, to me, it's very mobile, but it's also very strategic as well. Having the right ammo type makes a big difference. Pierce for those long monsters that are long way. You have your spread shot, you have your sticky bombs, which could do KO damage, and you also set up these mines on the ground as well. So leading monsters to the right spot where you have a stake set up that they can blow up on, hitting wounds with the right spot as well, and mounting and doing damage on top of that makes the light bowgun super fun. Now, I haven't seen anything major around the ammo management, I think one of the cool parts about the light bowgun and the way I describe it is that it feels more like it's a strategic weapon. Having the right ammo type for the right situation, setting up for the right ammo, and also replenishing your ammo properly is a big part about using the light bowgun properly. You're still going to have some really nice mobility options. It's not going to be as mobile and counter-centric as we had in Rise. It's going to be closer to the world version, but you're still going to have that kind of option for you as you're using the light bowgun. And I think the ability to use these stakes on wounds is going to make the light bowgun a lot more fun. There's also a brand new mode for the light bowgun, which, you know, if you compare the light bowgun to the heavy bowgun, light bowgun is faster with lower damage, heavy bowgun is slower with more burst. They kind of have modes that allow them to play around that a little bit easier. So since the light bowgun is very mobile, very flexible, they have a mode that allows them to fire multiple ammo types at once. So they'll go into this mode and be able to fire a whole bunch of ammo all at once, giving them some nice burst options if they feel like the monster has been downed or KO'd or offset. They can use this new mode to fire a bunch of ammo in a burst to get a big damage bonus on the monster. Next up is the heavy bowgun. This is the speedrun weapon of Rise. It has always been the highest damage output weapon, and unlike the light bowgun, it is very slow. Now in World, we had attachments where you could put shields on it and you can guard, and those are going to be there in Wilds, which means you can have some blocking options for you if you want to stay slow and deal damage to the monster as they're coming towards you. There's also going to be some auto block or auto guard options as well, so that you will automatically avoid attacks in certain circumstances, which has that built into it. But most of the heavy bowgun is knowing the exact places that you can stand without getting hit and lining up huge, massive burst shots on the enemy to do ridiculous damage. And like I said before, they are very much a speedrun weapon. And because of that guard option, you could actually do clashes with the heavy bowgun, which is going to be super fun. It's also a weapon that's super fun in groups when you can get people to pull aggro off of you as you're using your big damage attacks. And I think one of the fun parts is that, like the light bowgun that had mobility, was able to get burst damage with their new special ammo mode, the heavy bowgun will have the same thing. They will have a new mode that allows them to deal more consistent damage with their ignition mode, which means that they will switch to this rapid fire machine gun setup where they're able to do a whole bunch of really good damage without having to lay on the ground or lock themselves in place, which gives them a little bit more flexibility to move around in some encounters. Next is the bow, which is a super fun, flexible weapon. I think one of the biggest complaints about the bow, especially on console players, is just how precise you have to be with the weapon and how mobile and high uptime it can be. This is a very high APM weapon where you'll be dashing side to side, maintaining charges. If you've never played the bow before, you charge up with each attack, and then you want to get to the maximum charge and maintain that. And they've added new ways to do it by using the new abilities for the bow. And they've also added a way where you can do heat-seeking shots depending on a meter that you build up during the fight. Now, the bow has always been a high stamina consumption weapon, going from side to side, dashing constantly. Usually you need to use dash juice. You have the specific accessories and decorations that allow you to maintain high stamina consumption in order to get the bow going. But they've got a bunch of new options and abilities that make the bow very interesting, and it's probably going to be the biggest value add for any weapon in the game so far. You have a lot of new options for power coatings and how to apply them. You can have more of them as well. You also have this new meter that builds up, and if you fill it up, you're able to do tracing attacks, which means you can mark the monster, and whether you miss the shot or not, the arrows will curve and hit the monster, and this works for your big shots as well, your wind-up shots, to do damage and curve and hit the monster as well. They also brought the Mystic Archer ability where you can mark spots on the monster, have them all fly at the target and deal a whole bunch of damage from that as well, which I think is super awesome and allows the game to feel a little bit more ability-based with the bow. And they also added this little side flip. You'll notice that there's these side dashes that are very common with bow usage, which allow you to move side to side. It'll consume stamina, but you'll maintain your charge state. But there's also this new side hop counter ability that is super great for the bow as well. If you time it properly and hit the side dash at the right moment, it'll trigger this special hop attack, which will give you tons of bonuses and ways that you can play off of it, and gives you that nice little counter. It's not a true parry like it was in Rise, but it gives you more flexibility up close. You can actually actually hit weak points, create shots. But I think all these new additions are going to make the bow a lot better for people that don't have perfect aim, especially with controller, and also for people that just don't want to deal with high octane movement with the dash juice. You now have a lot more options for playing from medium range and also different ammo types that are going to make the bow very appealing for a lot of people. Next up is the switch axe, which is a fan favorite in most Monster Hunter games. It is a very flexible weapon that, as the name would suggest, allows you to switch between having an axe or a greatsword. The general gameplay involves using the axe to build up meter so that you can switch into your sword mode and unleash massive attacks for heavy damage. Now, in Rise, they gave them a crazy parry that allows them to just sit in front of the monster, parry, and release big, large attacks. They're not going to be as strong, but they're keeping most of the parry combos and parry abilities that they had in Rise, which means that they are, just like the greatsword, able to sit in front of the monster and with proper timing and technique can trade blows with it, kind of like a lance. Now, the counter that they added in Wilds is similar to the one that we had in Rise, though a little bit weaker. I do believe there is some chip damage, and you also have to do a startup animation. It's not an instant like you would get with some other parries, but it is still there that allows you to play off of it. On top of that, they're going to give you more options in axe state to build meter with an additional follow-up from their 2-hit string, which I think is going to be a nice addition on top of everything else. You can also do zero-sum discharge as well as the full discharge on enemies, and I think it's going to make it a lot more fluid when going from axe to sword and back and forth. And you also have powerful attacks aside from the wild swings that we have in axe form to actually deal good damage in axe form while you're building up meter. So put all this together, I think it's going to be similar to how it was in World, but going to be an improvement by taking some of the best parts of the Rise changes, including the parry that makes the switch axe a very heavy hitter. And I think this is probably going to be one of the better weapons to use if you're looking for very flexible, wide-ranging gameplay. Next up is the Charge Blade. It's probably my least used weapon, but it is a cult following kind of weapon. People that use Charge Blade absolutely swear by it. It is very flexible. You technically have 3 weapons in one. You have your normal sword, you have your shield that you can do different attacks with, and then you can also combine them together to make a giant axe for a bunch of different play styles. And kind of like the Gunlance, where you have a wide variety, you can play with the chainsaw style, you can play with full super amped elemental discharge style, and there's a couple variants on elemental damage as well, depending on how you want to play. It gives you a lot of options for that as well. Now, if you're someone who hasn't really played a lot of Charge Blade, you probably won't notice the difference in Wilds overall, because most of what's changed about Charge Blade is really just the available options when switching between different attacks and different modes. You still have your guard points, you still have your combos, you still have your switching between sword and shield into your axe form, you still have your overall combos of using, depending like the style that you want to use, and the full amp. However, what's different about it, and also based on the focus mode that you have, you will actually end up in different stances than you did before. So if you're a Charge Blade main, you're going to feel this a lot when you play. You may expect to be in sword form, but you won't. You'll be in axe form when you come out of certain combos, or when you switch between things, you'll definitely be in that state. Now, they did allow you to charge files a little bit easier in some cases as well, and I think the idea is you have to be in axe form in order to use your focus mode as well, which is going to feel a little weird. I wonder if they're going to end up backing up on this and changing this towards the end of the launch cycle. Once they finally get to launch, they might swap this up. But I think overall, the Charge Blade is staying in its former glory in a very heavy way. And if you're a hardcore Charge Blade fan, you'll notice there are some new mix-ups and changes between the transitions of states for you. And if you're thinking about trying Charge Blade, I think it's going to be a great time. It's still going to be one of the best weapons in Wilds. Next up is a fan favorite of the series, the good old-fashioned large chunk of metal that you swing at the enemy, the Greatsword. And this weapon has always been one of the staples, one of the poster childs of the Monster Hunter series. It involves winding up the weapon for long periods of time and lining it up properly so the strike hits the monster at just the right moment to do a ridiculous amount of damage. Now, the tackle was, just like many of the weapons in Rise, super amped up, especially in Sunbreak, which made it so the tackle could go through basically anything. It's not going to be as strong as it was in Rise, but you do have some options for moving between attacks using the tackle, and there's also actually a perfect guard with the weapon, and it also means that you can do clashes with the greatsword as well. So you're not going to be as invincible as you were in Rise. And it being their poster child, I think they didn't want to change the greatsword too much. It benefits from some of the changes it got in Rise with some of the immunities. The perfect guard is going to be a nice change as well, but they also allowed a little bit more movement between slashes, and they also increased the speed rate between your full combos to be able to deal damage more directly. On top of that, being able to clash, having the perfect guard, and now they also have a perfectly timed offset where you can mini stagger the monster if you hit them right when they hit you, means that you're going to be a lot more offensive with greatsword. And I think this is going to be probably the best time if you're someone who's been looking into getting into greatsword, or you find the weapon interesting. It's going to be less punishing than it was in World, and that you had to really know the monster to get full value out of it. I think all the new mechanics that are going into the greatsword, while the base moveset is not changing much, is going to make the greatsword a lot more accessible for a lot of people. Next is the edgiest weapon in the Monster Hunter arsenal, the dual blades. It is just two small swords or daggers that you use to play like Levi Ackerman from Attack on Titan with crazy heavy attacks. If you're wondering how this weapon plays, it is basically a high uptime weapon. You are always attacking, moving, strafing, comboing, mixing. It's a very easy weapon to pick up, just like the sword and shield, but it does have a decently high ceiling in that knowing where you are in your current combo and how to move between combos as you go around makes a big difference between a good dual blade player and an average one. The base moveset for dual blades is staying mostly the same. However, there's going to be one major difference mechanically that dual blade players will notice, and that is when you are in your demon mode or your archdemon mode, certain attacks will consume meter rather than refill it. So what they really want you to do in Wilds is be able to plan out your demon mode or your archdemon mode and then use them for the right combos to dish out damage and then reset and get back into it, rather than trying to extend it for as long as humanly possible. So it's more of a gameplay loop rather than an extended burst window. For some people, that's going to be a plus. For some people, that's going to be a minus. Now, to go along with this, they added a lot of flexibility options for dual blades. You can now change directions with your side round slashes. So if you move to the left and move to the right, you can change that as well. This is true in your demon form as well. And they also have some perfectly timed dodges when you go into demon dodge or demon attacks inside your amped mode, which means that if the enemy attacks you right as you do a demon dodge, it will allow you to dodge that attack completely and continue your combo. You can also go between combos in your normal demon form into the archdemon form and mix those up as well and give you a lot more mobility options. And on top of that, the special, iconic ability for the dual blades where you spin dang the monster's back is now going to have a new option. You don't necessarily need to do an aerial attack like you had to in previous Monster Hunters. You can now use focus mode to latch onto the monster, fling around them like your Levi Ackerman, and then trigger the downward spine attack where you spin to get that extra damage out of it, which I think makes it a lot more flexible for some monsters that have some movesets that are harder to get that move off of, or you just can't find elevation to get above the monster and hit that special Beyblade. Lastly, we have Long Blade, a weapon that has in many cases been one of the most powerful weapons in the game, and in recent years, the last 5 years or so, has been heavily focused on counters and being able to react to the monster. And I think the version that we're getting for Long Blade or Longsword in Wilds is going to be the best version of the weapon that it's ever been. It's taking the counter and the follow-ups from Rise, which made the weapon a lot more flexible, but keeping the sheath attacks and the EI stance play-ups that we had in World, putting it all together to create a very powerful and very fun version of Longsword. Now, again, if you're someone who has never played Longsword before, you'll probably not notice the difference that goes into Wilds. You have to be someone who has really played a lot of Longsword. They're changing how some of the moves transition between them, and one of my favorite changes is you'll be able to sheath while in the air. So when moving between positions, you actually sheath for the II sheath. And if you've never played Longsword before, this weapon is all about building up meter so you can do a big attack called a Helm Splitter where you slice down on the enemy and deal damage. They're adding a new follow-up after Helm Splitter, and they're also adding new follow-ups between your different combos, which means that you can continue it into other attacks dealing damage. And the weapon overall, I think, feels way more fluid and more reactive rather than just sitting there hoping the monster attacks so you can sheath, combo, counter into it. They still have their counter, but their follow-ups are going to be more like Rise. So if you're used to World's version of Longsword, I think that you're going to be pleasantly surprised with how powerful the weapon remains, but how many options you have when going between different 3-hit combos or 2-hit combos, or even following up from your helm splitter going into the attack itself. So I think this is probably the most polished and most enjoyable version of Longsword we've had in a while. I think it was a little too strong in Rise and a little bit too one-dimensional in World, and they're blending those two playstyles together in Wilds to make it very flexible and very fun. But that's what I have for the weapons in the game and which weapon you should be playing for the demo. Let me know what your thoughts are and whether you're going to be one of the weapon mains and you've already decided which weapon you're using down below. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.